Hi, this is Donna Warren again with the Critical Thinking Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and today I would like to continue our discussion of argument evaluation. And in fact, I would like to double back to the previous video in which we talked about arguments that assume the conclusion, because somebody reached out to me with an excellent question about that, and I think it's important to do some clarification. So, quick recap. As we've seen, an argument is a unit of reasoning that attempts to establish that one claim, which we call the conclusion, is true by citing other claims as evidence. An argument is good, basically, if it does that. So if the argument successfully establishes that the conclusion is at least probably true, we say that the argument is good. If an argument doesn't do that, if it doesn't successfully establish that the conclusion is probably true, we say that the argument is bad, although it's really important to note that what we're looking at here is not whether the conclusion is true or false, but rather whether the argument has established the conclusion is true or false. So we could certainly say, I think this argument's bad because it has not established the conclusion is true, but I do think that the conclusion is in fact true because I have some other independent reasons for accepting it. We've seen two questions that are very useful to ask when we evaluate arguments, and they have to do with the premises. Premises are claims that an argument takes for granted without proof, right? We saw that the first thing we should ask is this true? If it turns out that the premise is probably not true, then it can't establish the truth of the conclusion. And so we can say that that argument, or if we have an argument that has multiple lines of reasoning, we can say that that line of reasoning is bad. A line of reasoning is just a pathway to the conclusion. If we think that the premise is true, we should go on to ask a second question. Could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that the premise is true? Because if our answer to that question is no, then that premise assumes the truth of the conclusion, and basically, rule of thumb, we cannot establish what we presuppose. Because an argument is trying to establish the truth of the conclusion, it shouldn't presuppose the truth of the conclusion. And that's where we ended last time. Then somebody reached out to me with a really good question, and I thought, yeah, I should probably clarify that a little bit. So here's how we can clarify it. First, let's do a little bit of philosophy, just for an example. Act utilitarianism is an ethical theory that says when we try to decide whether a specific action is good or bad, what we should look at, or what we should consider, is whether that action tends to produce the greatest utility for the greatest number of people, or the greatest happiness, or the greatest good for the greatest number. So, for example, suppose that you have a choice of what to do on Saturday evening. You can go out to a movie with your friends, let's say for the sake of discussion, 3 friends, and your 3 friends and you would sort of enjoy going out to this movie, or you could help one other friend move, and that friend really needs help moving. And let's say that that friend has a number of other people depending on her. So it's not just one friend, but let's say maybe a family of 4. So you have a choice. Do you go out to the movie with one handful of people, or do you help your friend and another handful of people move? Act utilitarianism would probably say you should help your friend move, because even though you personally might not enjoy that as much, the net amount of happiness that you would be bringing to the world by helping your friend move is probably greater than the net amount of happiness that you would be bringing to the world if you attended the movie with your other friends. Got it? So here is an argument against act utilitarianism. The first claim is, if act utilitarianism is correct, then it's ethical to kill one innocent person in order to harvest her organs and save 5 other people. Or at least that could, under some circumstances, be ethical. And do you see why? It's because, I mean, you're sure you're killing one person, but you're saving 5 other people. And, you know, the happiness that those 5 other people might bring to the world is probably, or maybe, or conceivably, greater than the happiness that the one person you killed might bring to the world. At the very least, you are saving 5 lives and ending 1. So by engaging in that action of homicide and organ harvesting, you are certainly increasing the number of lives lived. But intuitively, that seems really wrong. Intuitively, it seems like it just is not ethical to kill one innocent person in order to harvest her organs to save 5 other people. So that's a fairly standard argument against act utilitarianism. Let's evaluate it, and let's use those two premises for evaluating, two questions for evaluating premises. First question, is this true? Second question, could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that it's true? So let's do that for each of these premises. The first premise, if act utilitarianism is correct, then it can be ethical, at least under some circumstances, to kill one innocent person to save 5 others. So just think about that. Do you think it's true? And do you think that someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion could think that it's true? You can pause this video right now and think about it if you want. Okay, so what did you decide? I think it's true. I think that act utilitarianism would have us say that. And I think that someone could believe that premise even if they don't believe the conclusion. So I'm going to say, yeah, I think that that premise is fine. Now let's do those two questions again for this premise. Pose those two premises, those two questions of this premise. Is it true? And could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that it's true? And I'll give you a little while to think about that. You can pause the video. Okay, what did you think? It isn't ethical to kill one innocent person in order to harvest her organs to save 5 other people. Do you think that's true? Maybe, right? I think that might not be ethical. The second question, could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that it's true? So now we have to do that shape-shifting we talked about last time. Imagine that you really think that act utilitarianism is correct, right? You are a true believer. You accept act utilitarianism. Could you accept that premise? Could you think that it's unethical to kill one person to save 5? I don't think you could. I think that if you are an act utilitarian, and hence, if you reject this conclusion, if you reject the idea that act utilitarianism is wrong, you won't accept the premise. Problem. This premise looks like it presupposes the truth of the conclusion. The only people who could accept that this is unethical are people who already maybe think that act utilitarianism is incorrect, or at the very least, if you are absolutely committed to act utilitarianism, you're not going to accept that premise. So, according to our kind of technique or system for evaluating arguments, it looks like we should say that this argument's bad, right? Well, surprise. Some people, some philosophers would say that that argument is good. What gives? I mean, it's not as though they don't recognize that maybe there could be some assuming of the conclusion going on there. So let's see how someone might think that this argument is okay in spite of that. First, we need to talk a little bit about theory and data. And this is a very useful distinction that plays out all over the place. You get it in philosophy, obviously. You get it in social sciences. You get it in the physical sciences. You get it all over. This distinction between data, or specific observations of the world, and theory, or a set of general assertions about the way the world works. Generally speaking, we assume that the theory is a strict function of the data. So the standard picture is sometimes that you go out in the world, you see a bunch of data, and then you formulate the theory, right? So we assume that the data comes first and the theory comes second. At least often that's sort of how it's presented. But in fact, it's more complicated than that. But here's an example of, I want to talk about how it's more complicated, but here's a little example of how we might tend to think it works, right? This is the story of Darwin going to the Galapagos. Standard story, Darwin goes to the Galapagos, sees a whole bunch of finches with their beaks, and notices that those finches have, those beaks on the finches allow the finches to eat and hence survive and hence reproduce and hence pass on those traits to other baby finches. Voila, right? Data, observations of finches, theory, theory of evolution by natural selection. What could be more obvious, right? You have the data, you have the theory. I just said before it's a little more complicated. Let's see why. In fact, theory and data are kind of mutually reinforcing, and there is sort of a saying that the theory determines the data, or there is no, the data is always theory laden. And sometimes that can sound sort of mysterious and very sophisticated, and oh, you have to really be a philosopher to understand this, but you don't. Here's an example. Suppose you have a friend who is a complete die-hard materialist, right? She's a scientist. She has no time for talks of spirits or talks of ghosts or talks of anything paranormal. No, absolutely mainline materialist. Then suppose you and your friend are walking in an old building and you see something that for all the world would look like a ghost. The ghost for your friend is going to be what we can call an anomaly. An anomaly is just a piece of data or an observation that doesn't fit the theory. If your friend is right, what she's seeing might be many things, but a ghost it is not, right? On the other hand, if she is in fact seeing a ghost, then her theory can't be right. That's what makes an anomaly anomalous. What we have here then is either the theory or the data has to be wrong. Something has to give. So should we, on the one hand, kind of accept the theory and either reject or accept the data rather, or reject or adjust the theory? Or should we accept the theory, retain that model of the world, and reject or reinterpret the data? Theory or data? If the data is anomalous, which goes? The answer to that question really depends upon where our confidence lies. Are we more confident in the theory, in which case we should think that there's something wrong with that anomalous data? Either it didn't happen at all, or we are not properly interpreting it. Are we more confident in our anomalous observations than we are in our theory, in which case we should reject or more likely adjust the theory in order to accommodate that data? Same thing is happening here, right? Do you see that? Here we have act utilitarianism. That's like our theory. That's like saying there are no spirits in the world. Then there is this observation or moral intuition. Hey, you know what? It's just not right to kill one person in order to save 5 others. That's an anomaly. If act utilitarianism were right, that should be okay. It isn't. So we have a piece of data in the form of a pretty compelling moral intuition that just doesn't fit the ethical theory of act utilitarianism. And so what should we do? Should we accept the theory and reject the data and say, guess what? Might be right to kill one person to save 5 others. Or should we accept the data and reject the theory? And this argument does that. This argument effectively assumes that the confidence that we have in our moral intuitions, at least in this case, is sort of better placed than the confidence that we have in an abstract ethical theory, at least in this instance. In general, that's how it works, right? We can have like a linking premise that says, if the theory is right, then we shouldn't see this thing. And then we say, guess what? We do see this thing. We can say then that the theory is wrong. Or we could say, yeah, if the theory is right, then we shouldn't see this thing. And I think that the theory is right, so I don't think I'm seeing this thing. I think that this anomalous data should be either rejected or reinterpreted. What this means is we can add a kind of nuance to our former system. Everything is the same, but when we get down here to this question, could somebody accept the premise if they don't already accept the conclusion? If the answer is no, I still think that we should step back and think maybe this is an argument that assumes the conclusion in kind of a problematic way and reject that line of reasoning, and if the argument only has one path, reject the argument as a whole. But we should be ever cognizant of the fact that sometimes what the argument might be trying to do is effectively force a choice between accepting a piece of anomalous data and accepting a theory. And under those circumstances, we might want to step back and say, maybe this is one of those times when effectively what looks like assuming the conclusion might be okay, because really what the argument is attempting to do is show that there's internal contradictions involved if we want to accept a theory and the anomalous data simultaneously. So it's forcing that choice. So I hope that's useful. I know it can seem, pretty abstract, but it can be helpful to be aware that theory and data is a thing. The relationship between theory and data is a little bit more complicated than just you read the theory right off the data, because sometimes you can use the theory to reject anomalous data. And sometimes when arguments do that, it might look like they are assuming the conclusion, but they might not be. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you're having a great time. Hope everything's well on your end. And I'll catch you later. Bye-bye.